security and durable development outcomes. So these are just a few of these issues, Mr. Secretary, that are on the top of my mind and others. Our appreciation I want to express for the strong support for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria for their replenishment cycle. And now I would like to once again thank you for your tireless work on behalf of our country and look forward to your testimony. And first, I would like to yield now to my colleague, our ranking member, Mr. Rogers. Thank you again, Mr. Rogers, for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, welcome back before the subcommittee. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. In these extraordinary times, I want to convey my gratitude to you for your service and for taking time to share with us today. It was not long after our hearing with you last year that things began to deteriorate rapidly in Afghanistan. The manner in which the United States left Afghanistan sent messages to everyone around the world. For our allies and partners, it raised legitimate questions about whether the United States is a reliable partner. For our adversaries, it signaled weakness and a lack of resolve. The most dangerous regimes around the globe were watching closely. Iran, North Korea, China, Russia have increased their capabilities and hostile actions since last summer's debacle. I do not believe this is a coincidence. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was made up of many failures that, taken together, will have lasting consequences for U.S. security. I hope you and other senior leaders in this administration are committed to restoring the reputation of the United States following those dark days last summer. You have a tremendous opportunity to begin doing so by continuing to support Ukraine's heroic resistance to Russia's unprovoked, brutal invasion, which is inspiring the world. We and our allies must continue to provide the assistance critical to defeat Russian aggression and help preserve Ukrainian independence. Here I should note that the strong and unified response of our allies and partners to Putin's campaign of conquest has been both striking and deeply welcome. For European republics who thought that war was a 19th or 20th century concern, who perhaps believed that the environment was the preeminent challenge of our times, this crisis has underscored the importance of capable military alliances, the centrality of NATO, and the critical importance of American leadership in the transatlantic alliance. I know this impressive marshaling of resolve does not happen by accident, and that is due in no small measure to the tireless work of our diplomats, soldiers, and intelligence community. As we think about the work of this committee, how are we to make sense of the challenges of our time? And how should that understanding inform the department's budget? Historical analogies can be misleading, but if we look to the past, there are many disturbing parallels to the late 1930s. In the heart of Europe, an authoritarian Russia has brutally assaulted the people of Ukraine, attempting to dismember that state and decapitate their government. To the east, Putin's partners in Beijing are not only supporting the invasion of Ukraine, but more ominously accelerating efforts to dominate the Indo-Pacific and overturn the rules-based international order. In this circumstance, America's priorities should be clear. The centerpiece of American strategy needs to be rallying and defending our fellow democracies, as well as other supporters of the rules-based system against this axis of autocrats. If we and our allies are to prevent the emergence of an era in which the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, then investments in the tools of hard power are essential. Now, if we are to deter and shape the imperial aspirations of our great power rivals. As one American historian notes, quote, "The invasion of Ukraine signals a new phase in an intensifying struggle to shape the international order. The democratic world won't have a better chance to position itself for success." Mr. Secretary, before I close, I want to note that this year's budget request for state foreign operations looks fairly similar to what was requested last year. It represents significant increases that are not attainable and misaligned with the urgent priorities of our nation's foreign policy. I encourage you to focus on what really matters and proceed with caution when considering funding commitments that are above and beyond the resources that you already have in hand. The credibility of the United States will be further diminished if checks are written that cannot be cashed. Once again, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us for these few moments. Look forward to your testimony.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me now yield to the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Granger, for any opening statements you may have before the Secretary's presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Blinken, we appreciate your being with us during this very busy time, and thank you for your service. Threats to our own security, as well as the security of our partners and allies, dominate the headlines every single day. I look forward to your testimony in order to better understand how the United States is continuing to assist Ukraine, strengthen the transatlantic alliance, and respond to the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Please speak to how the budget request would address the threat from China as we continue to watch them try to increase their power and influence around the world. Mr. Secretary, as we face these threats in Europe and Asia, we must also focus on the dangerous situation at our southern border. I've been engaged in this issue for many years, and what we see today is absolutely startling. In just the past 6 months, Border Patrol agents have encountered 1 million migrants crossing the border illegally. When I chaired this subcommittee, we could not have imagined reaching numbers this high in a 12-month period, much less 6 months. Due to this administration's failed border policies, illegal crossings have skyrocketed, and it's only getting worse. We're on track to have an enormous surge of migrants this summer that will crush our already overwhelmed Homeland Security agencies. The administration's request to increase aid to the Central American countries is short-sighted when your current border policies are enticing people to illegally enter the United States. We can't expect these countries to use our assistance effectively to uphold the rule of law and improve living conditions if we're not doing our own part to enforce the law at our border. Now to the Middle East. I just returned from the region and had the chance to visit Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey. The region continues to face the growing threat of a hostile Iran and its terrorist proxies. I want your assurance that the current negotiations with Iran will not result in a flawed deal. Honestly, Russia and China's involvement does nothing to give me confidence in the outcome. It's also crucial that many talks address Iran's destabilizing role in the region, including its ballistic missile capabilities. Mr. Secretary, you have a very difficult job, and we all wish you success as you work to advance America's interests abroad. I hope you'll consider the issues I raised today going forward. Thank you for your time today, and Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Granger. Secretary Blinken, if you could summarize your oral statement in less than 5 minutes. I want to make sure that we leave time enough to get to our questions. And I realize you have a hard stop at, I believe it's 12:15. Your full statement will be included in the record. After your testimony, I will be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority members. I will then recognize any remaining members in order of their appearance. Each member is asked to keep their questions to within 5 minutes per round. Again, Mr. Secretary, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Lee. It's great to see you, Ranking Member Rogers. Ranking Member Granger, thank you for being here today as well. It's very good to be with you. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak to you about the administration's proposed budget for the State Department. As you know, I recently returned from Kyiv with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, where we sought to demonstrate by our presence as well as by our actions the United States commitment to Ukraine and its people. This brutal war of aggression being committed by Russia against Ukraine has brought into sharp focus the power and purpose of American diplomacy. Our diplomacy is rallying allies and partners around the world to join us in supporting Ukraine militarily, economically, and with humanitarian assistance, to impose massive costs on the Kremlin for its aggression, while strengthening our collective security and defense and addressing the war's mounting global consequences, including the refugee and food crises that you've alluded to. We have to continue to drive that diplomacy forward, to also seize the strategic opportunities and address the risks presented by Russia's overreach as countries are reconsidering their policies, their priorities, and their relationships. The budget request that you have before you actually predates the crisis, but fully funding it is critical to ensuring that Russia's war in Ukraine is a strategic failure for the Kremlin and also serves as a powerful lesson for those who might consider following the same path. As we're focused on this urgent crisis, the State Department continues to carry out the missions traditionally associated with diplomacy, particularly responsibly managing great power competition with China, also facilitating a halt to fighting in places like Yemen and Ethiopia, pushing back against the rising tide of authoritarianism and the threat that it poses to democracy and human rights. We also face evolving challenges that require us to develop new capabilities: the emergence and reemergence of infectious disease, an accelerated climate crisis, and a digital revolution that holds both enormous promise but also peril if not managed correctly. A few months ago in the fall, I had a chance to set out a modernization agenda for the State Department and for U.S. diplomacy to respond to all of these demands and all of these needs. And in no small part, thanks to the significant FY22 budget that was approved by Congress, we've been able to make real progress on this agenda, but much remains to be done. Just to give you a few quick examples, we've strengthened our capacity to shape the ongoing technological revolution so that it protects our interests, it boosts our competitiveness, it upholds our values. With bipartisan congressional support and encouragement, we recently launched a new Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy with 60 team members to start. And this is something that was done very much in collaboration with and with the Council of Congress. We're also making headway on ensuring our diplomats reflect America's remarkable diversity, which is one of our greatest strengths. As the chairwoman said, our department's first ever Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, has spearheaded an effort to analyze and address the obstacles that prevent underrepresented groups from joining and advancing at the department. We've expanded the Pickering and Rangel Fellowship programs, and we have paid internships at State. Again, strong congressional input and support for these initiatives. We recently welcomed a new cohort of 179 exceptional Foreign Service professionals. That puts us on track for our largest annual intake in a decade. These first 15 months on the job for me have only strengthened my conviction that these and other reforms are not just worthwhile, they're essential to delivering for the American people. Today's meeting, by our count, marks the 103rd time that I've had the opportunity to brief Congress in one way or another, meetings, calls, which is one of the ways that I've worked to meet the commitment I made in my confirmation. to ensure that Congress's role as a partner, both in our foreign policy making and in modernizing the State Department, is realized. Ensuring that we can deliver on this agenda requires sustained funding, requires some new authorities. Most importantly, it requires our partnership. If we want to deepen our capability in areas like climate, like public health, like multilateral diplomacy, if we want to expand on Secretary Powell's vision of a foreign service training float, if we want to strengthen global health security to prevent, detect, and respond to future outbreaks, we need these additional resources. If we want to be able to swiftly stand up new missions, to deploy diplomats when and where they're needed, and make these decisions based on risk management rather than risk aversion, we need to reform the Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act and the Accountability Review Board statute. If we want to rapidly scale up the response to crises like refugee surges and epidemics, while also avoiding costly overhead, we need more flexible domestic hiring authorities. These are just a few examples, and I just want to stress in closing, this is not about advancing the goals of any one administration or any one party. It's about refocusing our mission and our purpose on the forces that are affecting the lives of all of our fellow citizens, their livelihoods, their security for decades to come. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today about why this matters and look forward to working with this committee, the subcommittee, Congress as a whole, as a partner in these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I'll start out by, and I'll try to make my questions, because I have many, as consolidated and concise as possible. One, the failure of the emergency COVID funding package last month and the imminent exhaustion of funds of global vaccination campaigns is deeply, deeply concerning. Can you describe the consequences of not being able to deploy vaccines that the United States has already purchased and not reaching the 70% vaccination goal target? And also, I know next month you'll be co-hosting another global COVID summit with international partners. What do you expect to come out of those discussions? And how will uncertainty around COVID, the global vax and US efforts, how will that impact or limit our leadership? And then my second question is, as it relates to the Eastern Caribbean, I just returned from a conference with parliamentarians from Barbados and other Eastern Caribbean countries. One concern that I heard over and over again was their inability to access global climate assistance and additional development assistance due to being classified upper to middle income countries by the World Bank, even though they repeatedly are in the bullseye of hurricane after hurricane, and they are impoverished countries. They face serious threat to their lives, their homes, and their livelihoods from these storms, and much of the impact hits the poor the hardest, of which there are many. And so I want to know what we can do, because I know the United States, quite frankly, has been missing in action in terms of the Caribbean. So what can we do to address these needs of our neighbors right next door, to address these barriers, and to combat the effects of the storms and the climate crisis, recognizing how vulnerable they are? I mean, we've talked a little bit about a vulnerability index, and also just how can we demonstrate to the people of the Caribbean that the United States values their partnership and will help better increase our bilateral relations, and that we recognize them as a region worthy of our friendship and partnerships. They're our closest neighbors, and they deserve to be seen and be part of our foreign policy and funding priorities, which in the past, and we talk about China and other outside actors, we've been, quite frankly, missing in action.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much for both questions, and thank you for your consistent focus on COVID and in trying to ensure that we have the funding to pursue this. Look, this has been, I think, a very significant and important success for us in two ways. First, of course, substantively, the president's commitment to get 1.2 billion vaccine doses around the world is making a big difference in being able to address the immediate challenge posed by COVID. And as you said in your own opening statement, we know that unless we get to this everywhere, no one, including Americans, will be fully safe. We always run the risk that as long as this is moving around, even in distant shores, that a new variant could emerge and undo some of the, much of the progress that we've been able to make at home. So we need to stamp this out, and we need to try to do the best that we can in getting to the goal that was set for the entire world, which is getting to 70% vaccination by the end of this year. That's a tough goal to meet, but we've got to drive toward it. The other way, though, that this has been important and a success is our standing in the world. Our diplomacy has been enhanced by the fact that we have committed to donate these vaccines, to do it through COVAX so that they're distributed equitably, to do it with no political strings attached. This is in stark contrast to China, which has been selling vaccines and been using them as a cudgel to get countries to do what it wants in a variety of ways. And as I go around the world, I'm hearing in virtually every place gratitude for what we've done and appreciation for the fact that we're doing it in a way that is in stark contrast to the way that China is doing it. Now, the challenge we have immediately is that we do have a sufficient supply of vaccines. The problem is getting shots into arms. It's the last mile, particularly in Africa, but also in other parts of the world, including in our own hemisphere. And we have a program where we've gotten other countries to stand up. It's called the Global Action Plan, to stand up to take responsibility geographically and functionally for dealing with these last mile challenges, getting shots into arms, cold chain storage, making sure that there are distribution routes, healthcare workers to administer shots, support for those healthcare workers, other things that go into this, including therapeutics, PPE, et cetera. And we have countries that have stood up to do this with us, to take responsibility, but we need to continue to engage and show the way. And the money that we have to do this is running out. If we do not get additional resources to do this, we won't be able to get the job done. And I think that would be a big mistake substantively, and it would set us back in terms of our standing in the world. Quickly on the Caribbean, the president met with the leaders of virtually all of these countries at the COP26 and talked at great length about the climate challenge that they're facing, as well as other challenges. And I very much agree with you that we have an issue with this middle income trap of another kind, which is the fact that, as you said, some countries classified as middle income nonetheless are bearing the brunt of COVID and bearing the brunt of climate. And we need to find ways to more effectively help them as they adapt and build resilience with regard to climate change. We're talking to the international financial institutions about that. We're looking ourselves at what we might be able to do. We have significant resources dedicated to climate, and particularly that go to building adaptation and resilience in countries that need help. That's in the budget, and I hope we can get that done.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and we'll follow up with you. We have some specific recommendations out of the last visit led by Chairman Price with the House Bipartisan House Democracy Partnership. And so we'll follow up with you on this. I'll yield now to Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, while we and our partners have made a strenuous exertions to support Ukraine against Putin's brutal invasion, more challenges lie on the horizon. With security assistance for the Ukraine from the initial supplemental largely exhausted, I look forward to reviewing the supplemental request we have just now received just a few moments ago. What specific new security assistance resources, including additional presidential drawdown and other military assistance, what are needed over the next 3 to 6 months to sustain Ukraine and bolster NATO's deterrence against Russia?
Thank you very much. And yes, I'm glad the supplemental request is now just before you. And this is critical to sustaining our efforts in a variety of ways, sustaining our efforts in terms of security assistance to Ukraine, but also vital in helping partners and allies continue to bolster their own security. A number of these countries, for example, have themselves supplied equipment to Ukraine. They now have some gaps as a result. But in short, the request, and I speak just based on what I had last night, and it's possible that what you have before you has some modest changes to it. So I want to make sure that what I'm saying reflects exactly what you have. But more or less, the supplemental request would provide for $15.5 billion in security assistance, some of that through foreign military financing, some of that through presidential drawdown authority, some of that through the Pentagon's equivalent of FMF, as well as programs like INCLAE and NATOR for things like demining. That is the bulk of the request that's before you, and it would address the needs that Ukraine has now for the equipment that it needs to continue to repel this Russian aggression, as well as supporting allies and partners.
With respect to Ukraine's economic and fiscal challenges, what mix of bilateral and multilateral assistance is being considered to help support the resilience of its people and sustain the government? As you know, the needs are immense. Ukraine's finance minister projects that the country needs $5 billion a month just to cover its own budget purposes, an amount that doesn't include the eventual costs of reconstruction. Where will this funding come from?
You're exactly right, Ranking Member Rogers. So the supplemental that we have before you includes about $8.5 billion in economic support. $7.5 billion of that would be for direct budget support to Ukraine and via ESF. And that would account for about $1.5 billion a month of the deficit you rightly point to that Ukraine has. Other countries, with our leadership and encouragement, are coming together as well, along with international financial institutions, to help fill the rest of that gap. There are various pledging conferences that are taking place in the weeks ahead that we're very much engaged in, including with European partners. But the objective is to get to that goal of making sure that Ukraine can meet its needs. Most of this is most effectively done through direct budget support, at least over the near term, to make sure that the resources can get to the Ukrainians and they can use them quickly. There's some other things in the SUP that you have before you, but the bulk of it is direct budget support.
On the humanitarian side, what are your estimates for additional needs to support internally displaced populations as well as refugees? And how closely are you coordinating with Kyiv in the development of relief plans?
There is an extraordinary need, and it's reflected in two ways. It's reflected, of course, in the huge number of refugees, more than 5 million who are outside of Ukraine. Now, most of them hope very much to be able to go home. They've left, in many cases, sons, husbands, fathers behind who are fighting. So they want to go home. And in fact, we've seen in the West a change where there are more people going back into Ukraine than going out. However, in the South and the East, I think we can anticipate more refugee outflows, which is where the fighting is focused. And so we have resources both in the budget and in the supplemental request to address the needs of the populations both inside of Ukraine that are displaced as well as outside, and also to help the countries that have taken in so many refugees be able to support what they're doing. The Europeans have been incredibly generous with this. Refugees who are in Europe now have the ability to be there for 2 years and to get benefits and support for those 2 years. So this is, of course, a burden on some of our partners. We're working to address that, but the primary focus of the request that you have before you is focused on making sure that humanitarian assistance can get to people who need it in Ukraine, as well as the refugees who are immediately outside Ukraine.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Now I will yield to Ms. May.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your testimony here today. And I'm pleased to see that the State Department's budget justification supports $2.6 billion to advance gender equity and equality. I was particularly excited to see a 400% increase in funding for the Office of Global Women's Issues at State. However, what is not clear in the administration's budget justification to Congress is how the administration accounts for the $2.6 billion. The administration has previously stated prevention and response to gender-based violence is a top priority, with a newly updated strategy on preventing and responding to gender-based violence globally. Does this doubling of funding for gender equity and equality include increased funding to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, including the Safe from the Start program? And how will the department uphold protections against gender-based violence as a core pillar of diplomatic efforts, programming, and operations?
Thank you, and let me first thank you for your leadership on this issue for a long time. It's greatly appreciated and has also inspired our own efforts. Yes, the focus of the budget request in this area, first, the overall number, the $2.6 billion to advance gender equality, to prevent and respond to gender-based violence and to promote women, peace, and security is vital and critical. And within that, for gender-based violence, the request is $252 million. That's a $77 million increase from fiscal year 22. As you know very well from all of the work that you've been doing on this, gender-based violence has become a more acute problem, especially during COVID as a result of lockdowns, mobility restrictions, economic insecurity, the shadow pandemic. So we have in this budget various programs to offer support services and to use our foreign assistance and our diplomatic action to address the challenge. One critical aspect of this, from my perspective, is something we focused on, which is making sure that we have a gender-based approach to water, sanitation, health, and hygiene in refugee and displaced persons situations. Because again, as you know very well, this is critical, making sure that things are accessible, sex segregated, safe supplies. This is very much part of our focus, and the resources that we have will help us advance that, including in our work with international organizations. And we anticipate that some portion of these resources will support Safe from the Start to prevent and respond to GBV at the start of emergencies. I agree with you that that's critical, because if we can get ahead of this, we wind up not having to play catch up with a problem as it evolves.
Thank you so much for that. My second question is, with the Taliban now in control in Afghanistan, many Afghani women and girls are now being denied access to secondary education. I appreciated your March 23rd statement decrying the Taliban's actions to limit educational opportunities for girls and women, saying education is a human right. Yet a few days later, the administration released a budget that would reduce international basic education funding below congressionally appropriated levels, which included a reduction in funding for vital bilateral education programs and multilateral programs where U.S. leadership is so important. For example, the Global Partnership for Education and Education Can't Wait. Secretary Blinken, can you outline the administration's views on these programs and plans to increase funding for education programs, GPE and ECW?
Thank you. Let me say first, just to your point about Afghanistan, this is something that we're intensely focused on, and particularly the denial of basic rights to all Afghans, but also and especially to women and girls. And within that, this focus on education. One of the things that we'd worked to do was to make sure that as long as the Taliban was actually making good on commitments it made to ensure that girls could go to school, that we could, and the international community could find ways to support teachers, including with stipends. But as you know very well, some weeks ago, they reneged on that commitment, and girls above the 6th grade, for now at least, are not able to go to school. This is a grievous violation of commitments that the Taliban had made, as well as, I think, a disastrous development for the future of the country. So resources that we have the resources if the Taliban reverses this decision to support, for example, teachers in Afghanistan, to make sure that once girls go to school, there's actually someone to teach them. But I focus on this because it's one example of places where we've seen a tremendous backsliding on the basic upholding of rights, especially for women and girls. As I said, we're intensely focused on this. I created 2 senior positions in the department focused exclusively on Afghan women and girls, as well as human rights. We have a special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights, Rina Amari. I think she's known to a number of you. And she and her team have been engaged on these issues on a daily basis, as well as at the Hill. More broadly, on education and resources, this is something I am strongly committed to. We have to make assessments on, of course, trade-offs across the entire budget, which is always difficult, and an evaluation of how we think we can effectively use the resources and where they can be most effectively dedicated. So the budget you have before you is our best judgment, including in the area of education, of what we need and what we think is effectively possible to advance the mission. Having said that, we welcome working with you to look at ways to refine that if we believe that we need to do more and focus more in that area.
Thank you, Mr. Okay, I'll now yield to Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I just returned from Israel, as I mentioned, and I'm very concerned about the increasing violence. I remember the last time when Israel was being bombarded with rockets, the loss of life would have been much worse had we not invested in Iron Dome, a program I strongly support. The United States should be using assistance to the Palestinians as leverage for de-escalating tensions and preventing violence. Are you using this assistance as leverage? If not, why not?
Thank you, and I'm very glad you were there. I just returned a couple of weeks ago as well from Israel, as well as other countries in the region. And we have been intensely focused on exactly what you're talking about, because we didn't want to see a repeat of last year. We were able to get that back in check relatively rapidly, but damage was done, lives were lost. And we've been very focused on trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I sent a senior team to Israel to work with the Israelis, to work with the Palestinians, to work with the Jordanians and others to try to help everyone avoid taking actions that could precipitate more violence. And I think this has been largely, for now, I'm knocking on wood, largely successful. Second, thanks to Congress and your leadership, we were able to replenish Iron Dome in a significant way, which means that if there were to be attacks against Israel coming from Gaza and rockets, the Israelis would have, once again, the means they need to defend themselves. When it comes to Palestinian assistance, we have increased that assistance. We have it in our budget. We think it's vital that the Palestinian Authority, for all of its shortcomings, be supported, because the alternative is Hamas. And that's in no one's interest, starting with well, I'd say starting with the Palestinian people, but also starting with Israel, never mind us. So we're making sure at the same time that, of course, all of the assistance that we do provide is fully consistent with things like the Taylor Force Act. We are working very hard with the Palestinians to get them to end the so-called martyr payments that go to those imprisoned for terrorism or their families, and using assistance in a variety of other ways to try to make progress with the Palestinian Authority.
Thank you. I have a second question. Just last month, Iran fired as many as a dozen missiles at the capital of Iraq's Kurdistan region. This is the latest in a string of attacks by Iran and its proxy forces. First, how is the U.S. government assisting our partners so they can push back at Iran? And second, can you commit today that you will not sign on to a new nuclear agreement with Iran unless they stop their destabilizing actions in the region?
Thank you. We're working very closely with all of our partners in the region to help give them the means, as well as our own means, to push back against myriad destabilizing actions by the Iranians, including things like missile attacks, support for terrorist proxies, etc. For example, we're trying to ensure that countries have the defensive capacity to deal with incoming missiles via proxies like the Houthis against the United Arab Emirates and against Saudi Arabia. We are working to interdict the movement of weaponry, to sanction various entities involved in that, and doing that in a way that is very collaborative with all of our partners in the region, Israel, the Arab countries, et cetera. And of course, we're taking necessary measures to protect our own forces. I will say that two things. First, when it comes to the Iran nuclear agreement, that's still something that is being engaged in to see if we can get a return to mutual compliance. I would tell you this is no longer a hypothetical exercise, because we've seen what the situation looks like with the agreement when it was enforced. We've seen what it looks like without it. And I can tell you that from the perspective of American interests and American security, we've clearly been better off with it than without it, not only with regard to Iran's nuclear program, but indeed with regard to its destabilizing and dangerous activities. From 2012 to 2018, when we started to negotiate the original agreement, to the time the previous administration pulled out of it, there were virtually no attacks on Americans in the region, Iraq, Syria, you name it. Since then, those attacks have gone up dramatically. Since we pulled out of the agreement, since we designated the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, since Soleimani, for whom no one is shedding any tears, was killed, those attacks have gone up dramatically. From 2019 to 2020, the attacks against Americans in the region went up 400%. At the same time, despite the maximum pressure effort, Iran's nuclear program has gone full steam ahead. And whereas we had a breakout time of more than a year for Iran to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon under the agreement, now that breakout time is down to a matter of weeks. So the question is not one of the theoretical. The question is, what is the most effective way for us together to deal both with the Iranian nuclear program, but also with its destabilizing activities and the threats that it poses to us and to our allies and partners. And one way or another, we're going to do that. If there is an agreement, that agreement takes in no way away from us any of our abilities to deal with Iran's other dangerous actions, the ballistic missiles, the support for terrorism, et cetera. If there's not an agreement, similarly, we are going to make sure that we're doing everything we can with allies and partners to address these challenges.
Thank you very much.
Now I will yield to Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. We're happy to have you with us, and commend you and your colleagues for the hard work you're doing. And you're facing this daunting array of challenges around the globe, with prioritization required, but also an attentiveness to areas that we make sure we don't let slip and let slide, because we must remain attentive. I have a particular lens on this by virtue of chairing the House Democracy Partnership, which works cooperatively with parliaments in emerging democracies around the world in a kind of mutual effort to share best practices and offer encouragement and support. And that leads us to focus on democratic progress or democratic backsliding, or worse, which is going on in the countries we work with. We, of course, are distressed with the ongoing coup, the persistence of the situation in Burma. We keep a close eye on Sri Lanka, Kyrgyzstan, other countries. And I want to focus today, and I should say Ukraine. I mean, our partnership with Ukraine has been very, very solid, especially since Maidan. And we knew our Ukrainian colleagues were striving to build a democratic institution and to determine their country's course. But of course, we had no idea what brutality Russia was capable of, or what courage and resilience the Ukrainians would exercise. So we of course support every effort to back our colleagues in Ukraine. And by the way, the Ukrainian Parliament has managed to meet in the midst of all this, and itself has shown great courage. I want to focus today on Tunisia, a country that is widely described as the only democratic success story of the Arab Spring. I think that's probably accurate. And it's a country that over a decade managed to keep democratic development going. Leaders of the country received a Nobel Peace Prize for extraordinary efforts at one juncture. But now there's been a turn for the worse, and it is not getting better. Since the middle of last year, Tunisian President Said has dissolved parliament. He shuttered the Independent National Anti-Corruption Authority. He seized control of the Independent High Authority for Elections. He's consolidated his power over the judiciary, and he stated his desire to outlaw foreign funding for civil society. And as you're well aware, the National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute have had a significant presence in Tunisia. The Biden administration has spoken out against this, has said that it, quote, shares the Tunisian people's goal of democratic government responsive to the country's needs. The question is, what can we do? What are we doing? Are we doing enough? I think a lot of us have thought that this was a situation that wasn't quite as desperate as some others, that it was subject to diplomatic influence. What does our toolbox look like here, and are we fully utilizing it? And then just quickly, of course, the budget is part of that. And you are cutting the aid to Tunisia in this budget by a good amount. I'm not sure what the rationale is behind that and how it relates to trying to influence the movement of that country back into the democratic family of nations.
Well, thank you. And can I just first thank you for an extraordinary 34 years of service in Congress and for your leadership on issues of democracy. It's greatly appreciated, and it's been making a difference around the world. I share the concerns that you've just expressed. Tunisia had been a relative success story in the region, one that we long supported through a couple of administrations. I share your deep concern about the unilateral dissolution of the parliament. I've spoken to President Said myself a number of times on this. We are pressing for a transparent, inclusive, to include political parties, labor, civil society, reform process. He's committed to holding a referendum in July and to holding parliamentary elections in December. Ideally, that would have moved a lot faster, but at the very least, Tunisia needs to hold to that. They've had a consultative process, as you know, for the reform agenda for the Constitution. Very small percentage of eligible Tunisians have actually participated in that. It was online, and I think about 6.5% of Tunisians actually participated. That does not augur well for something that is really an inclusive process of reform. Also, we've seen the use of military courts to prosecute civilians, particularly for political speech. That's something we've been pressing back against, and infringements on civil society, on judicial independence. All of these factor into our assistance. And so part of what you have in the budget before you is an assistance plan that is calibrated on the realities that we face in Tunisia now, but with the ability, if President Said moves the country back onto a better track, to provide additional support for Tunisia going forward. At the same time, I think the most important thing that they need to do is to make themselves fully eligible for support from the international financial institutions. And again, what's happened now has gotten them off track on that. So they have a tremendous, as you know, crisis. They've got a direct, an immediate budget crisis, and then they have a long-term economic sustainability crisis. The long-term economic sustainability crisis is best met by working with the international financial institutions. Others potentially could provide some direct budgetary support, but honestly, that is dependent on the president moving the country to a better track. We've been urging that. We've been making clear that our support can be there, but we need to see Tunisia return to the track that it was on. So we're looking at all of these things I just described as indicators of whether things are moving back on track. If so, our support can increase.
I'll
Thank you
yield
very
it
much.
to Diaz-Bayard and try to ask everyone to stay within our 5-minute time frame. Mr. Bayard, Diaz-Bayard.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Secretary, let me first thank you for what I thought was a very important visit to the Ukraine in a pivotal moment. I thought that was again, a very important thing, and that you did, and I thank you for that. And I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I don't expect you to know, these are folks that have rewards over their heads. These are major narco traffickers, murderers. The Department of State has rewards, $5 million over their heads. But I do know that you know this individual that has a $15 million reward over his head. This is
I can't quite see. Can you tell me who?
Sorry, yeah, this is a smaller picture. This is the narco terrorist individual Maduro of Venezuela. $50 million reward over his head. There's also here another major, Maduro ally who has also a $10 million reward. So let me tell you what was hard to understand was when high-level members of this administration, Department of State, met with Maduro in Venezuela. By the way, without even telling the legitimate, recognized president of Venezuela that meeting was taking place. You might as well met with El Chapo as well, right? I mean, or these other individuals. And so could you please assure me that I read that stopped after it was made public that the Department of State has now decided not to meet with Maduro, his cronies, or his other thugs. Can you reassure me that there are no meetings taking place with Maduro or other narco terrorists that have these rewards over their heads, or others that may not, between this administration, your administration, and these thugs in Venezuela?
Thank you for the question. Let me just say two things quickly. First, we continue to recognize the interim presidency of Juan Guaido and the 2015 democratically elected National Assembly as the representatives of the Venezuelan people. And we are doing a number of things to support the democratic aspirations of Venezuelans. The trip that you referenced was focused on two things. It was focused on securing the release of detained Americans. This is something that we and I are focused on around the world. When we have arbitrarily detained Americans, people being used as political pawns, we're working around the world to get them home. And the trip was focused on getting them home. We managed to get 2 of those arbitrarily detained Americans home. And I'm very pleased about that fact. We're going to continue to get the remaining Americans home. The other aspect of this trip was focused on pressing the Venezuelan regime to get back into talks in Mexico City with the unitary government to move forward on trying to get democracy and human rights back on track in the country. That was the purpose of the trip. There are currently no other engagements. The Maduro regime made some commitments about getting back to these talks, but we haven't seen that develop yet.
All right. Well, so right now there are no talks, and that's correct.
That's correct.
Okay. Good. You're not new at this, Mr. Secretary. You're well aware that the Castro regime has used mitigation to extort concessions from U.S. governments that they perceive to be weak over the years. They did so with President Carter. They did so with President Clinton. They did so with President Obama. And no surprise that they're now trying to do it as well. By the way, this was forewarned. Many folks talked about that. Senator Marco Rubio warned about that. A lot of us, I've mentioned that over this year, that it was very unlikely that the Castro regime would not try to do it with this administration. And they're doing it now with this administration. And so I know that there, again, have been meetings between members of your team and the Castro regime. The irony, though, is that, again, we've seen this pattern before. When the Castro regime detects weakness, they use migration to try to extort concessions. You, in a hearing in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, said that no such talks would take place without first notifying and consultations with the Cuban American community. Mr. Secretary, you said that publicly, and yet that's not what happened. So I just want to remind you that you made a commitment which you have not kept, which I think is, well, unfortunate. Are those conversations still taking place? What is the nature of those conversations? And is the United States looking at potentially giving concessions to the Castro regime in order to, placate this latest attempt to blackmail who they perceive to be a weak administration?
Congressman, a couple of things. First, as you know, and we have the same objectives. We're focused on 2 basic principles when it comes to Cuba: the establishment of democracy and human rights, and empowering the Cuban people to actually determine their own future. So, same objectives. There are good faith judgments among many about the best way to do that, but those are the objectives. We, like you, have been deeply concerned by the worsening human rights situation in Cuba, and that really means going from bad to worse, including the unrelenting crackdown that we've seen since last July, and as well as an economic crisis that is, I think, having very challenging effects on the Cuban people. There are, by our count, about 740 political prisoners currently in Cuba. That includes Afro-Cubans. It includes minors. Minors, and extraordinary sentences, 30 years in some cases. So we share these concerns across the board. When it comes to the talks, there have been over many years and many administrations talks with the Cuban government on specific issues where there's a mutual concern. And yes, we've had migration talks with them just about a week ago. And this is to deal with a very specific challenge. We have, as you know, across the board, a historic migration challenge around the world, but also in our own hemisphere. And of course, it's not just Cubans. It's Haitians, it's people from the northern triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, it's Nicaraguans, it's Venezuelans, et cetera, et cetera. But the Cuban piece of this could exceed the arrivals that we saw from the Mariel boat lift back in 1980. So from our perspective, these talks are necessary to address our own interests in making sure that there is safe, legal, and orderly migration, including when it comes from Cuba. I think this is a double-edged sword for the Cubans. And look, you've probably forgotten more about this than I'll know. But the double-edged sword is that there's also a tremendous flight of talent from Cuba that the Cuban regime has some interest in also keeping at home for the future of the country, even the future that it would ascribe to. But the long and short of it is, I think these talks are important to address our interests in making sure that we have a handle on extraordinary migration.
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to yield now to the chairman.
I thank you for that, but there's no coincidence. It shouldn't surprise us that you're right. It was during the Carter administration and now during this administration, because the capital.
Okay, I've got to yield now to the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro. Also, I'm going to ask members to please remember we have to leave time for the secretary to respond to your question. We only have 5 minutes for each block of time. Thank you, Chairwoman DeLauro.
Thank you very, very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate the time, and I appreciate my colleagues in allowing me to move forward. Trying to deal with several hearings this morning and to be at as many as I can. Secretary Blinken, thank you for your testimony today and for your unwavering commitment to Ukraine and the bravery that you and Secretary Austin showed during your recent visit to Kyiv. You have my word that myself and this committee will continue to support Ukraine as they battle for democracy and freedom. If Ukraine is defeated, so too is democracy. I am proud that in coordination with the White House, the State Department, and with the chairwoman of the committee and the Appropriations Committee, we responded to the Russia's unprovoked war of aggression with $13.6 million in emergency assistance to support the people of Ukraine and its neighbors. We need to do more, and we must do more. To the extent it's possible, can you share with us what you saw on the ground during your visit to Ukraine? I know we recently, just recently received a formal request for a Ukraine supplemental package a few moments ago. How did your visit to Ukraine inform that request? What, in your mind, are the top priority items that have been included in this supplemental request?
Thank you very much. And thank you for your very strong support for Ukraine and for all of the efforts that we're undertaking there. A couple of things. We had this extraordinary train ride from the Polish border into Kyiv, about 12 hours. And I was extremely comforted in the fact that I was with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and I figured if anything bad happened, I would just get behind him and everything would be fine. But what we saw were two things. First, as you're going through the countryside in Western Ukraine, and then as you get to Kyiv itself, the country there right now looks remarkably normal. Kyiv itself, as best we could tell from in the time we were driving in the city to get to President Zelensky, looked like it was, back to something approaching normal life. People on the streets, even sitting at cafes. That was their Easter Sunday. So there's that to factor in. But it looked relatively normal. And most of the destruction that was done in the Kyiv area was mostly in suburban parts of it before the Ukrainians repelled the Russians and forced their retreat. That's in stark contrast, however, to what's going on right now in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, where the brutalization of the country by the Russians is going on full force. The Ukrainians have done an extraordinary job because of their courage in pushing the Russians back, but also because they had the means in their hands to do it. And a big part of the reason that's the case is because well before this aggression, as we saw it coming, we tried everything we could to prevent it, but we also prepared to make sure that everyone would be ready, including the Ukrainians. The president initiated a drawdown for security assistance to Ukraine last Labor Day. We did another very big one around Christmas time of more than $200 million. The result of those drawdowns before the aggression was that the Ukrainians had in their hands the anti-armor, the anti-air, and other systems that they needed to deal with the Russian attack in and around Kyiv. What's happened now, though, is that as the battle has shifted east and south, so has the terrain, and so have the needs of the Ukrainians. Secretary Austin and I spent about 3 hours with President Zelensky, his defense minister, his chief of the armed forces, foreign minister, et cetera. And a big part of the focus was on what is it that the Ukrainians need now to deal with the specific challenge they're facing from Russia in east and southern Ukraine. And among other things, what they need are longer range artillery of a heavier caliber. They need armored vehicles, tanks. They need shore to ship weapons to deal with the Black Sea, and a number of other things. So we spent a lot of time on that. Much of this is already in the most recent drawdown that the president has done, but as well, European partners and allies are providing this equipment. The day after our meeting, Secretary of Defense went on to Germany, where he convened 40 defense ministers, an extraordinary thing, to focus in on making sure we were together providing what the Ukrainians needed. The supplemental request that you have before you has the resources that we would need in a variety of ways to actually get this job done. And it includes about $15.5 billion in security assistance, much of it for foreign military financing and the Pentagon's equivalent of that program, as well as significant funds for additional drawdowns from our stocks. It also gives us the means to help allies and partners who have given their weapons to Ukraine to backfill. And that's really critical. I know you know this, you've heard this. That's in the supplemental as well as in our budget request. Foreign military financing is the best way to be able to do this. And that's in the budget and it's in the supplemental.
Thank you very much. And the backfill piece is very, very important because while we have, it looks as if there's probably almost $20 billion for defense in this supplemental, but that means coming from the U.S. So that backfill piece is very critically important to making up the difference here. Madam Chair, thank you very, very much. And thank you for chairing this subcommittee. And I think it's fair to say that in a bipartisan way, we are committed to making sure that we can help Ukraine sustain its democracy because it means democracy worldwide. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being with us this morning. I'll yield now to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And Secretary Blinken, thanks for being here this morning. I wanted to just revisit some of the responses you gave to Ranking Member Granger. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you basically indicated that it was your belief that Iran and its proxies have been relatively well behaved since the Iran nuclear deal. I just got to push back on that a little bit because I think it might be myopic just to focus on Iran itself. When Iran is funding proxy wars, the Houthi rebels, for example, in Yemen, propping up the Assad regime, money to Hamas in Israel, Hezbollah in Lebanon. So do you still stand behind that statement that Iran has been relatively well behaved since 2012?
Congressman, you're right that would be putting words in my mouth because here's what I said, and if I didn't express myself as clearly as I should, let me try again. What I said was that in terms of Americans, diplomats, military, et cetera, in the Middle East, from 2012 when we started to negotiate the original agreement to 2018 when the previous administration pulled out, there were virtually no attacks on our interests in our immediate interests, diplomats, forces in the region. There were absolutely attacks against allies and partners, and that is a problem that we've been focused on during the pendency of the agreement. Nothing in the agreement took away from our ability to work with them to push back on that, but I was talking about Americans. And what we saw after pulling out of the agreement, after the designation of the IRGC as an FTO, after the killing of Soleimani, again, for whom no one is shedding a tear, we saw those attacks go up dramatically against Americans, 400% from 2019 to 2020, despite maximum pressure. And so the question is, how can we be most effective in two things? How can we be most effective in dealing with the Iranian nuclear program, which also has galloped forward under maximum pressure after we pulled out of the nuclear agreement, where they're now on the verge of having the capacity to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon within the space of a couple of weeks. as opposed to more than a year under the agreement. And they continue to act even more aggressively. This policy that has been followed the last few years has not deterred them. On the contrary, they're doing worse in all areas, nuclear and the destabilizing activities. So I think the question we have to ask, all of us have to ask ourselves, because we have the same objective, is how can we be most effective in dealing with both of these problems?
Well, thanks for clarifying. I still have to push back because I think we're still not looking at the Shia militia groups in Iraq, which are clearly being led by the IRGC. But
now they are. That's my point. What's happened? You're exactly right. What we've seen the last few years is an absolute increase in attacks by these groups. You're exactly right. But that was after we got out of the agreement, after the designation of the IRGC, after Soleimani, et cetera. So you're right. And we're deeply, deeply not only concerned about that, but acting against it. But my only point is none of this is a hypothetical exercise. We've seen what the world and the region looks like when we had the agreement. We've seen what it looks like without the agreement. We need to take stock of that and deal with that effectively.
I'm still incredibly concerned that if we do get an agreement, we're not going to be able to do anything to protect our allies in the region, specifically Israel, and also we're not going to be we're not going to be able to control Iran to use the proxy groups in Iraq, the Shia militias, to attack our bases in Iraq. But I only have a minute left, Mr. Secretary, and I would really like to talk about Taiwan. I think that Dictator Xi is looking at the disaster that was the withdrawal in Afghanistan, the weakness. I think we've shown vis-a-vis supporting Ukraine. I think we should be much more robust in our support, and we should have done more earlier. But be that as it may, I'm very concerned that the CCP will invade Taiwan. Do you think that we should just affirmatively right now say that we will militarily defend Taiwan? And additionally, what can we be doing now to give Taiwan the weapons they need to defend against an invasion?
I share your concerns about Taiwan. We've seen Beijing act increasingly aggressively toward Taiwan over the last few years. I'd say two things. First, I think that Beijing does and is looking very carefully at what's happening in the response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and is seeing this extraordinary response that American leadership helped produce in terms of the massive consequences we made clear would follow if Russia committed the aggression. And the unprecedented sanctions, the unprecedented export controls against Russia are having a devastating effect. In the near term on its economy. We're looking at a 15% contraction of the Russian economy. All of the gains of the last 15 years wiped out. We're looking at Russia being unable to modernize key industries, including defense, including energy exploration. All of this, and we've seen the exodus, as you know, of something like 800 companies from Russia because of reputational risk. So, quickly put, the response that we've given to Ukraine, I think, is concentrating some minds in Beijing. But second, and to your point as well, it is vital that we continue to do everything that we've been doing over many years and are continuing to do now to make sure that Taiwan has the means to defend itself. And we've seen significant transfers of defense articles to them. We've had about $18 billion in foreign military sales since 2017. That pace continues. We've had about $2.5 billion in direct commercial sales. And we are looking to do a number of things, including improving delivery timelines, an intense focus on that, but also making sure that Taiwan is thinking in terms of asymmetric defense to any kind of potential aggression from Beijing, and working closely with them on that. So I think we need to be continuing down that track. We've had on Taiwan for many decades a success in making sure that its democracy could thrive and emerge while the status quo was preserved, both by Beijing and by Washington. The challenge to that status quo is coming from Beijing, and we need to make sure that Taiwan has the means to defend itself so that it deters any possible aggression.
But what about just affirmatively saying that we'll...
yield to Ms. Frankel now, Mr. Rushenthaler. You're 5 minutes.
I know, but Madam Chair, the question wasn't answered. I mean, the question was, can we just affirmatively say that we'll defend Taiwan militarily? It wasn't answered.
We're going to try to have a second round where we
Okay,
can follow up. Okay.
Thanks,
you.
Mr. Secretary. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Ms. Frankel now.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. The reports of sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war against Ukrainian women are deeply appalling. It's horrendous. The stories that we're hearing. So I have a couple of questions related to that. Are there any realistic efforts that can be made to stop that particular kind of violence? What kind of efforts are you making in terms of with the supplemental emergency funding to support the survivors of the sexual violence, including many who are becoming pregnant? And what is there any extra accountability that that Russia can be held to?
Thank you, and I share your view that these reports are appalling, and we continue to get new ones every day. As this Russian tide has receded from parts of Ukraine, we've seen what's been left in its wake. And one of the things that's been left in its wake is clear evidence of gender-based violence and other atrocities. So two things on this. First, we are very focused on supporting efforts at accountability.
I'm getting some feedback from someone who is not muted. Okay, continue.
Thanks. There are a number of efforts that are going on to try to ensure that there is accountability, and accountability, especially when it's visible, may serve as something of a deterrent going forward, but we want to regardless make sure that there's that accountability. We're directly supporting the efforts of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and her team to accumulate evidence and to be able to prosecute war crimes of one kind or another. And we have our experts who are working with them every single day. Second, because we were able to get back on the UN Human Rights Council, one of the things we were able to do was get it to stand up a commission of inquiry into abuses of human rights, including gender-based violence in Ukraine, and we're supporting that effort. Third, we've welcomed the International Criminal Court opening an investigation, and I believe we can find ways to support that investigation going forward. And a piece of each of these investigations will be the crimes committed against Ukrainian women and girls. At the same time, we're looking at how our assistance programs can provide support to victims, to survivors. The funds that you have as a request before you, both in our budget, but also in the supplemental, I think some of that can be used to address that aspect of the humanitarian concern that we have.
Like I just urge you to keep your talking loud and top of your lungs on this violence that's going again on the women in Ukraine. I want to just a quick statement on Grace Meng's on education. There's still 130 million girls out of school internationally, and 11 million of them who had been in school before COVID, it's predicted, will not go back. And I just want to say that education is a game changer for girls and for their communities. So I hope that you will pursue efforts to make sure to try to reduce the barriers around the world that are keeping girls from school. On another, let me see how much time. Okay, so on the Iran agreement, I think, listen, we all agree we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Two quick questions on that. What do you see as the current role of Russia, and what do you see as the current role of Congress?
Thank you. So with regard to Russia, as you know, it's been a member of the group that has helped negotiate the original agreement, along with the European Union, France, Germany, the UK, and China. It remains part of that group. Since the aggression, it took some steps within the negotiations to make life more complicated, but the other parties in the group push back against that, and at least as we speak, they are not currently an obstacle to seeing if we can get back into compliance, mutual compliance, with Iran. But they would also have an important role to play in any such return to the agreement in terms of taking out of Iran the excess enriched materials and getting them out of the country so that the stockpile in Iran is kept at a level that doesn't allow them to break out and produce fissile material for a weapon on short order. So we would have to see if they would actually cooperate with that. There are no indications that they wouldn't, but something that we'd be looking at very carefully. And of course, when it comes to Congress, it's vital that Congress continue to be a full partner in this. Of course, during any actual negotiation, negotiations have to take place to preserve the ability to actually negotiate. But we've had our envoy and negotiator, Rob Malley, as well as his team, engage in a series of briefings and meetings with members of Congress. If this were to go forward, of course, we would be in ongoing close consultations with you on the details of any agreement. We're not there right now, but if that happens, we will be.
Okay, I'd like
to
yield to Ms. Torres. Let me remind members that you may submit your questions for the record to get a more thorough response if you feel that you haven't been able to complete your response, the answer to your question during this round. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I want to begin by thanking you and your incredible team for the work that you are doing, unifying the world to save the people of Ukraine and their democracy. When you came before this subcommittee last year, we spoke about the administration's goal in Central America to help stem the tide of migrants to the U.S. by ensuring that they have safety and the opportunity to thrive within their own borders. I'm glad to see the steps that you have taken in the Northern Triangle, including progress on diplomatic appointments, publicly naming corrupt and undemocratic actors, and funding civil society instead of government actors who seek only to advance their own personal interests. Thank you for your commitment to the fight against corruption in the region. We cannot give taxpayers money in foreign assistance to governments that continue to misuse it. Unfortunately, in the last year, we have seen civil society actors, journalists, independent prosecutors, and judges under attack in both El Salvador and Guatemala. El Salvador declared a state of exception that bypasses citizens' rights and exempts security funding from regular oversight. And in Guatemala, there's concerted attacks against independent judiciary. Some are in jail, afraid for their lives, or seeking asylum in our country. We can't trust these governments to administer aid to fight corruption and rule of law when they are doing everything in their power to work against those very issues. At the same time, the Northern Triangle is at a pivotal moment, and I believe the increased funding requested in your budget is urgently needed to support good actors who are continuing to fight corruption and upholding the rule of law. So, Mr. Secretary, given the lack of political will we have seen from some governments in the region, what clear and effective conditions will be required for funding our efforts to address the root causes of migration from Central America?
Thank you. And I share the concerns that you've raised, as well as the need to make sure that our assistance is channeled in an effective way and deals with this issue. And just quickly, I very much share the concerns about the countries that you mentioned. For example, in Guatemala, we've seen efforts to strip judges of immunity, expose them to retribution. We've seen meritless cases against the media that was trying to expose corruption. We've seen the arrest of anti-corruption prosecutors, et cetera. And similarly in El Salvador, we have real concerns about some of the steps that have been taken that have been backsliding from democracy. Having said that, two things. First, one of the things that we've been able to do is work effectively as necessary around problematic potential partners, including directly with civil society, directly with local government, directly with the private sector. And by the way, the vice president, as you know, last year did a call to action to raise investment resources for the Northern Triangle countries, and companies came forward with about $1.2 billion in new investments. And those private sector investments will go to creating opportunity and jobs for people in these countries in ways that will actually give them a choice between staying at home and or trying to make the hazardous journey to a country where they won't get in if they don't have an asylum claim. So that's a big focus. Second, we continue to take real action against corruption. In Honduras, we brought a case against the former president, Hernandez. We listed him first in a classified way. Then we did that publicly. We just, I think about a week ago, had him extradited to the United States, and obviously by the new Honduran government. So this is a very clear sign and a very clear message that we take this, not only do we take it seriously, we act on it.
Thank you. You know, I agree with all of the efforts. It's just very difficult for me to look at a company that is, you know, wanting to expand and provide an opportunity for jobs in the region without, you know, the warning label of these are very corrupt actors, and it will be very difficult to do business. But my time is up, and I want to be respectful to the rest of my members. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Now I will yield to Ms. Waxton.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your service and for your testimony. And thank you, Representative Torres, for being so gracious about yielding. Secretary Blinken, you know, I know a lot has happened since you were last before us, but I do want to follow up on a couple of the things that we spoke about when you were last here before us. First of all, staffing. I want to just commend the State Department on your efforts to make a dent in that 800 positions that you lost over the last 4 years. I also want to commend you on your efforts in hiring the new 179 foreign service positions and in making them more diverse than they have historically been. So I just want to say thank you for that. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the transnational threats to Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities who are fleeing persecution in China. We've heard reports from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and other countries about Uyghurs being forcibly returned to China, where they are likely to face, at the very least, violations of their human rights and even imprisonment or death. So I know how much you care about this issue, and I would like to work with you to address this growing problem, because I think we need a larger strategy involving international partners rather than just dealing with it on a case-by-case basis. So I hope that this will remain a priority for the administration, and I'd like to work with you in order to make that a reality, because I think that we can explore better ways to make sure that these countries know that they should not be violating these non-refoulement principles. And I think a lot more can be done on that. So thank you very much for that as well. First question I have for you is about opening of a consulate in Jerusalem. I do appreciate the budget's commitment to advancing security and prosperity for both Israelis and Palestinians. And consistent with that, President Biden promised that he would reopen a consulate in Jerusalem, specifically designated for Palestinian affairs, as a part of his pledge to restore economic and security assistance to the Palestinian people. And I know that has not yet happened, and a lot of people are clamoring for it to happen. I understand that you have put in a request in this budget in order for funding in order to make that a reality. How would you assess the likelihood of that happening?
Thank you. By the way, thank you for your initial comments, including, I think, the very good and important idea on dealing with non-refoulement obligations that countries have with regard to Uyghurs and others who would be persecuted if sent back to the countries that they came from. We've been working very closely on that and engaging a number of countries where there was a risk of Uyghurs being sent back against their will to China. But I think I like your idea.
The question about the consulate, that would be really.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I will come to that. I just wanted to thank you for raising that, because I also think the idea of working more collectively on that issue is a good one. So just to say that on the consulate, we're committed to reopen the consulate. That is remains very much a part of our plan. We are consulting with the government of Israel on that. Their support ultimately is needed for that, because they, for example, would have to give privileges and immunities to those serving in the consulate. So it's important that we do this, of course, with them and in consultation with them. I want to point out that it is important for everyone to recognize that the reopening of this consulate, which was there for well over 100 years before it was closed, would not affect in any way the U.S. Embassy Jerusalem or change our recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. But we're committed to moving forward on this, and we're working with Israel on that.
Very good. I'm glad to hear that, and I hope it will reopen. But I understand that the Israelis are very opposed to it, and since we will need their agreement, I hope that you would at least consider perhaps appointing a special envoy to the Palestinian people in order to be able to more and better engage with them diplomatically. Because my understanding is that they're feeling very ignored and very shunted off to the side at this time. So I was just in Ramallah with President Abbas 3 weeks ago, I think, despite the Ukraine crisis. I was in Israel, West Bank, met with a number of Palestinian civil society leaders, and we've been engaged with the Palestinian Authority across the board. Very good. Thank you, Secretary Blinken. And then my final question for you is, I also serve on the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And as you're probably aware, that is a bipartisan and bicameral commission that really focuses on human rights violations in China. And during the last administration, there was no executive appointees to the commission, and there still hasn't been an appointee from the Biden administration. So I hope that you will make it a priority to make sure that you guys get someone appointed. And
I will follow up on that.
I'll
follow up on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I'm going to yield back with 8 seconds to spare, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Ms. Torres, for helping us make up our time, and hopefully we'll be able to get to the second round. Thank you again. I will yield now to Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will claim those 8 seconds. Thank you, Secretary, for your appearance here today. Yesterday, we passed H.R. 4133, the Caribbean Basin Security Authorization Act, that allocates $75 million from 2022 to 2026. Could you highlight, Mr. Secretary, the benefits of the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative for that region?
So first, let me just thank you for your leadership on this. And one of the things we're trying to do more on, and I had an opportunity to talk to the chairwoman about this as well yesterday, is to focus more on the Caribbean Basin across the board. Of course, there's the climate challenge, which is, as you know very well, acute, and helping to make sure that our nearest neighbors have the means to engage in adaptation and building resilience to that. We talked about this challenge that is this middle income trap of another kind, by which some countries, because classified as middle income, don't qualify for some of the assistance that is given to countries that are classified as lower levels, and yet they are on the immediate receiving end of both COVID-19 and climate. So we're working on that and looking at that. I look forward to seeing your legislation and to looking at how we can work together more effectively, both to address resources to the Caribbean Basin, but also to engage. We're going to have a Summit of the Americas in just about a month and a half's time. Our CARICOM colleagues will be critical participants in that. President Biden's already had a couple of opportunities to engage with them directly, but I think the summit will be an important opportunity to look at how we can continue to deepen our engagement with them. I've had senior colleagues from the department who have just recently been working directly with CARICOM to look at what are the needs and opportunities for deepened cooperation between us and them. All of that we're factoring in, and there are different parts of the functional budget that can be used to address some of these needs. But also very happy to pursue that with you and your team as we focus in on this in the months ahead.
Thank you. I look forward to that. Last year, this committee passed language that addresses the needs of pregnant Haitian women that cross the border to the Dominican Republic for services with the near collapse of the health system there. And of course, that places a tremendous economic burden to the Dominican health system itself. And the language calls for our assistance in perhaps helping provide those services at the border for pregnant Haitian women. I wanted you to elaborate on perhaps how we can go about that.
Well, this is something, if it's all right, I'd love to come back to you on, because I have to acknowledge I wasn't aware of that specific provision, but it obviously identifies an important need. So give me an opportunity, if you will, to just talk to colleagues about that and then come back to you on it.
Yeah, it was followed by a bipartisan letter led by Congressman Diaz-Balart and myself.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll send you a copy of that. Finally, Mr. Secretary, as you know, the cost of energy, the oil, has put tremendous strains on Caribbean and Latin American countries. And many leaders feel what they call pobladas, which is civil unrest, because the price of essential goods and la canasta familiar, the family breadbasket, has gone up tremendously. And yet these nations have difficulty accessing the dollars that we may provide either through the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which the board which you sit on. And what can we do to help these? Otherwise, they're going to go to China. It's very simple. Yeah. They'll go to Venezuela or they'll go to China, because they got to survive, and the price of oil is just going through the roof. What can we do to assist them and exert our leadership in the region?
Two things. First, you're exactly right that we've seen, as a result of COVID, as a result of climate, and now as a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, a number of dramatic consequences for countries around the world, but not the least in our own hemisphere and closest to us in the Caribbean, in terms of food security, both the availability and the prices, and energy. And we are working intensely on both. And I'm happy to get into more detail. But broadly speaking, when it comes to food, we are making sure that World Food Program, Food and Agriculture Organization, have the resources they need to engage in their programs. We are incentivizing our own producers of fertilizer to produce more. We're getting countries that have stockpiles of food to release them and not to put export restrictions on them. And I'll be focusing our presidency of the Security Council at the UN next month on food security. And similarly, a number of steps on energy. But this comes back again to the point you were making before, we were talking about before, which is we want to make sure that, for example, the various financing programs that we have available, that countries are not statused out of those programs because of the income level at which they're assessed. This is something I'm looking hard at. It is very challenging, but I've recognized this problem. I heard it directly from Caribbean counterparts. And I spent some time meeting with the Prime Minister of Jamaica just a few weeks ago. This was one of the things that we focused on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. I believe we'll go to a 3-minute round now, so everyone can have at least another second round of questions. Let me just follow up, Mr. Secretary, on what Mr. Espaillat has been leading on in terms of Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. And when I was in the Caribbean, we talked a little bit about that, but one of the issues was in terms of what's broadening the definition of security as it relates to the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, and how perhaps resilience could be a part of that, and some redefinition of what security means under the context, under the rubric of the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. So that's just another issue that was raised. But let me ask you with regard to the treatment of Black and Asian refugees, African and Asian refugees fleeing Ukraine, being denied and detained at the border crossing. We've talked about this, and the International Organization for Migration characterized these reports as verified and credible. And so we did put into the omnibus bill a statement directing USAID and yourself to investigate such reports and to ensure that all individuals fleeing conflict were treated humanely and provided equal access to humanitarian assistance. So I'm just asking you to be sure to report back to us based on what is in the report, so that we get a good handle. We're still getting reports. We believe it's been reduced in terms of the mistreatment, but in terms of acts of mistreatment, but we're still hearing quite a bit. And with my 1 minute left, I want to just ask you about the diversity efforts of the Department of State, and what can we do to help escalate your efforts? I don't want to see it taking 5 or 6 years. We need to do this quickly, and we need to do whatever it takes as it relates to inclusion in the State Department, because we have to repair the damage of the lack of inclusion of diversity forever since the State Department has been in existence. And so I don't want to see us taking a long time to correct these unfortunate discriminatory practices. So what can we do to help move this quicker?
Well, first, I'm grateful for your leadership on this for a long time. Second, we're not waiting, we're acting. And we're acting in a number of ways that I think are genuinely historic. You referenced the appointment of the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, with her entire team. They report directly to me on the 7th floor. We have senior officials now in each of our bureaus responsible for tracking the diversity and inclusion and accessibility efforts that we're making. As a result of the work of this office, we now have a 5-year strategic plan that will hold us to account on whether we're actually succeeding in creating a department that actually looks like the country that it represents. And that plan was the product of intense work by the new CDIO, but also reflected comments before we put it out. I think of more than 700 of our Foreign Service and Civil Service officers. Next, we are instituting a program to focus on retention, because as you know very well, part of the problem that we have is not simply getting people through the doors of C Street to join. It's making sure that once they're in, they stay. And we've had real problems there too. And underrepresented communities in the department have left disproportionately. So clearly there are challenges. So
Mr. Secretary, my time is up and I want to yield to Mr. Rogers. And so I'll follow up with you.
Sure.
Submit the rest of my question, or you can respond to it in writing, but I want to get back.
Happy to do that.
Thank you again, Mr. Rogers. Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Madam Chair, thank you. Mr. Secretary, 7 months into Taliban rule, the world is witnessing an alarming increase in human rights violations against Afghans as the Taliban continue to show blatant disregard for international interests and norms. As you know, the fiscal 22 State Foreign Operations Bill prohibits funds from going directly to the Taliban. Several questions. How are you ensuring compliance with that requirement? Why are you seeking a national interest waiver to this prohibition in your budget request? In what circumstance do you believe it might be in the U.S. national interest to provide taxpayer resources to the Taliban? And then more broadly, what is the administration's strategy to address the human rights and humanitarian crises facing Afghanistan, including steps to support and protect opponents of the regime?
Thank you. First, broadly, you're of course exactly right that the Taliban have far from lived up to both public and private commitments that they've made to respect the rights of all Afghans, including particularly women and girls. There's widespread reporting of human rights backsliding and violations, and of course, the inability of girls to go to school above the 6th grade is one egregious example of that. A commitment the Taliban had made and that it reversed itself on. We'll see if that changes. We have been, at the same time, as we have been keeping countries together around the world to insist that the Taliban make good on the clear commitments that they've made, as well as the criteria that the international community has set in terms of respect for human rights, in terms for freedom of movement and the ability to leave the countries, in terms of making good on counterterrorism commitments they've made, in terms of having an inclusive government, that not only the United States, but the international community hold them to that, and, for example, not recognize the Taliban as a government unless and until it actually makes good on these commitments and on these requirements. With regard to assistance, though, our focus has been on humanitarian assistance because the situation for Afghans is dire. A huge percentage of the population is food insecure. A huge percentage of the population needs humanitarian assistance just to survive. And so we have done that work, including through the resources we provided through NGOs, through United Nations agencies that have tried and true means and methods of making sure that the assistance gets to the people who need it, not to the Taliban government. And that's been our focus. At the same time, we think that we do have to find ways to allow the basics of the economy to function. Otherwise, we will continue to put a humanitarian Band-Aid on something that will not hold back the trauma that Afghanistan is dealing with. And so ultimately, some ability to have teachers paid, civil servants paid, healthcare workers paid, some basic ability to have a functioning banking system. These are necessary. We're looking at mechanisms to do that. We want to make sure that we have the flexibilities to do that if we can find the right mechanisms in ways that don't benefit the Taliban directly, but do benefit the Afghan people. So the flexibilities that we look for in the law would be to enable us to do things of that nature. We're still working on the most effective way to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for your service.
Thank you. Now we'll yield to Ms. Bang.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to thank the State Department and its staff for its ongoing efforts to evacuate U.S. citizens, their family members, as well as our Afghani allies and partners from Afghanistan, and relocate those who are eligible to the U.S. As you're likely aware, I had many constituents and their loved ones in Afghanistan at the time of the Taliban's takeover, some of whom were stuck on lily pads for months and who have only just been able to return to the U.S. Again, I appreciate the continuous support of the Coordinator for Afghanistan relocation efforts, but I just had a few questions. It was recently brought to our subcommittee's attention by the CARE team that the Biden administration assigned a gender advisor to each of the lily pads used to evacuate American citizens, allies, and partners. This caught my staff off guard as the State Department never shared such information previously. Secretary Blinken, can you confirm that the State Department deployed gender advisors to all lily pads? From when and for how long were the advisors deployed? And is it State Department's policy to deploy a gender advisor in all humanitarian contexts? And if so, approximately how much funding is going toward the additional training and technical assistance required for the staff that serve in the role of gender advisor?
Yes, thank you for focusing on that. So as I recall, we sent gender and protection advisors to the Operation Allies Welcome sites in the United States, not at the lily pads, in the United States. One of the things we've been concerned about were reports of gender-based violence and abuse being committed against Afghan women and girls who had left the country. We wanted to make sure, including potentially in relocation places. So we wanted to make sure that we had that, as well as making sure that we had people who could give them expert, dedicated support. So that's where we did it. This is not something that we do in other places or around the world. The way we focus on this more generally is all of the staff in the Population, Refugee, and Migration Bureau, including folks in the field, are trained on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, protection of women and children in humanitarian situations. So they have, and they're the folks who are often deployed in different places. They have that training, they have that expertise. But we did this, the gender and protection advisors were deployed specifically to the OAW sites in the United States.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I will yield to Mr. Diaz-Bayart.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Secretary, we have very little time, so let me throw two questions at you, if I may. You talked about the horrors that are taking place in Afghanistan, particular to women and girls. So let me ask you, were you surprised that the Taliban would backtrack on their commitment, something they've always done? Were you surprised at that? Did it catch you off guard? Or did you know that they would do what they always did, which is backtrack on other deals and then do what they are now doing and they've done before, to women and children. So were you surprised, or did you know and you just thought it's okay, we'll, pretend it didn't happen? That's question number one. Number two is, there have been press reports about how three folks of the negotiation team on the Iran deal have stepped back. That's not usual. That's not very usual. It's not something that happens every day. And so you would understand why there's so much concern, right, about what may be or may not be in this deal when you even have folks from the negotiation team stepping back. Reports say they were concerned about too many concessions being given to Iran. If it's a good deal, then you would have no reluctance to bring it to Congress for an actual vote, an actual ratification vote, not just a fake one, but an actual ratification vote. So do you anticipate that you would bring it to Congress, not for a fake dog and pony show that doesn't have any teeth, for an actual vote for Congress ratifying or not ratifying it? So two questions. Were you surprised, or did you know what was going to happen, and would you bring it to Congress on the Iran deal?
Thank you. The second question first. We are, of course, looking at the law, including INARA, to make a determination whether, if there is an agreement under the law, it needs to come before Congress in that way. We take that very seriously. We will follow the law. So that's clear. Second, with regard to Afghanistan, no, we're prepared either way. We were extremely clear-eyed about the challenges posed to Afghanistan by Taliban rule, particularly with regard to human rights for all Afghans, but especially for women and girls. There are a number of very clear incentives that the Taliban would have to act in a way that actually upholds rights, including the significant support that they seek from the international community. We've led a very widespread effort to make sure that country after country would not provide that support unless the Taliban makes good on the basic commitments that it's made. And by the way, we led an effort to get a UN Security Council resolution laying those out. We succeeded in that. We got more than 100 countries to sign on to clear statements of expectations of the Taliban. And so the question is really before the Taliban. If they expect to be treated in any form or fashion as a government by the international community, there are basic things they have to do. If they're not doing them, they're not going to get that treatment. So a lot depends on how they see their own interests. On a number of fronts that are important to us, we've seen an absolute failure to make good on commitments they've made. Some other areas, they have done so modestly. For example, on freedom of movement, the commitment to allow people out of the country, that has actually gone forward. It's challenged by the lack of transportation means to get out of the country. But for example, we've had—
Mr. Secretary, can you complete that question, the answer in writing, so I can yield to Ms. Frankel and Ms. Jordan? If we have a few more minutes, we'll come back around to complete it during this hearing. I'll yield now to Ms. Frankel.
Thank you. Thank you again for your testimony. Secretary Blinken, I'm going to try to make this a quick question, two questions. One has to do with the Abraham Accords. We know that it has had, at least between Israel and UAE, there's been a big boost in their commercial interaction. Can you tell us how you envision the expansion and whether you think it is being successful? I know there's both UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco have become the first Arab nations since Egypt and Jordan to officially recognize Israel. That's question one. And the other one has to do with anti-Semitism, which is, we know, is just globally is increasing all over the world, and what kind of efforts are going to be put forth in that regard?
Great, thank you. With regard to the Abraham Accords, it is an absolute focus of the State Department and my focus to deepen them and expand them. We think this is a very important initiative in terms of Israel normalizing relations with various neighbors and countries close to it. I recently took part in the Negev Summit with the foreign ministers from Israel, from Bahrain, from the United Arab Emirates, from Morocco, from Egypt. So either early partners of Israel or new ones as a result of the Abraham Accords. And we have, and we're pushing forward on a shared agenda for cooperation and integration on everything from energy to water to food to tourism to healthcare. I had previously convened an economic partnership group between Israel, the UAE, and India to do joint infrastructure investments. That's something that we created coming out of the Abraham Accords as well. We've launched working groups with Israel and the UAE on religious coexistence, on energy and water. Now, none of this is a substitute for resolving the challenges between Israelis and Palestinians, but it's profoundly important, and it's something that we are driving forward. And
that's interrupted there, but on that point, how do you feel that the Abraham Accords can actually advance Israeli-Palestinian peace?
At our Negev summit, we spent some time talking with all of the participants about how we could collectively help address some of the needs of the Palestinian people, including, for example, supporting projects in the West Bank, 4G, solar projects, which would improve lives, supporting the Palestinian hospital network. And this is going to be very much a part of what the Abraham Accord countries actually do with Israel. So I think this can be, in that sense, a win-win because it is profoundly important to Israel to, and I think to countries in the region and beyond, to have a very new relationship and at the same time make sure that we are not leaving the Palestinians behind.
I'll yield now to
My time is up. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Blinken, on the topic of sanctions, I want to make you aware of a bipartisan bill that I introduced with Ranking Member Crawford on the Intel Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, requiring the State Department to look into the impacts of El Salvador's embrace of cryptocurrency on U.S. national security interests, including the effectiveness of sanctions. You know, I'm very concerned with the communication or lack of communication between Treasury and State around sanctions. I received some very important reports from you about corrupt and undemocratic actors in the Northern Triangle, and I understand that you revoked individuals' visas to the U.S., but the Treasury Department has not sanctioned them, even though the State Department has determined them to be working against U.S. interest. And in fiscal year 2022, I supported funding increases for the offices that deal with sanctions at both Treasury and State. So given, you know, this new bill that we have introduced and given the lack of coordination between State and Treasury, how can we improve communications between Treasury and State to ensure that, you know, we're maximizing all of our tools to bring attention to these bad actors?
I'm happy to follow up on that, but let me just say quickly two things. One is my sense is we have increasingly strong coordination between our departments, thanks to, it took a while, but we just recently got confirmed by the Senate. Our sanctions coordinator, Jim O'Brien, and a deeply experienced person who, again, reports directly to me. He's part of my larger office. He's going to be a terrific addition now, including making sure that we're well coordinated. At the same time, our Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs, Ramin Taloui, is deeply expert in these issues. He was, during the Obama administration, the Assistant Secretary at the Treasury for international, including sanctions policy, and of course knows his former department very, very well. So I think we have what we need to be fully coordinated. And of course, most important, I suppose, I'm in regular touch with my counterpart, the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, as well as the Deputy Secretary, Wally Adeyemo. Having said that, if you're seeing specific instances where you think something is not happening that should be happening, please let me know.
Yes, and I recently wrote her a letter addressing this specific issue and asking her to do more to coordinate with State. Thank you so much, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And first, let me thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your time and your testimony today. You gave us a very comprehensive understanding of the work being done around the world by the State Department to preserve U.S. leadership and support our global engagement. And so let me just say on behalf of this committee how much we appreciate the work of the people of the State Department to address these very complex issues and needs. And also, I was very heartwarmed last year when we received 6,500 requests, over 6,500 requests for our bill, the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee's bill, which really, I think, showed me, surprisingly, that it's not only this committee that has a keen interest in the work of the State Department and global affairs, but it's the entire Congress on a bipartisan basis. So you have a partner in this committee in this important work discussed today, but you also have a partner in the entire House of Representatives. Which I'm telling you was quite remarkable to see. So it really was very heartwarming, though, to see that. And so just know that we want you to keep us apprised of both the progress and your needs, and that we will work together as we move forward in this year's efforts with regard to the budget. So thank you again, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you very much.
Do you have closing remarks? If not, Mr. Rogers, you don't have any closing remarks?
No, we wish the Secretary well. Godspeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Rogers. We really appreciate working with both of you and working with every member of this subcommittee and the larger committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know that you will be submitting, and I want members to know they have questions. If they have questions to submit for the record, please submit them to the subcommittee within the next 7 days, and I'm sure we'll get the responses to the questions that are asked by the Secretary. So thank you all again very much. This concludes today's hearing. Bye-bye.